Dialogic Disciple is an invitation
to explore discipleship
in dialogue with the world as disciples of the Word. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Dialogic Disciple Podcast. My name is James Johnson and I am here with my co-host,
Elizabeth Shaby.
Elizabeth, we are quickly approaching Christmas.
It is Thursday.
It is Thursday and Christmas is going to be on Wednesday, and that, in my math, is less than a week away.
Wow.
Is that correct?
By the time
I'm not good
y'all
at math.
listen to this, it's going to be even less.
Yeah, and that's insane. I have to say, and you and I were talking about this the other day, but it feels like this Christmas season has just flown by.
It really has.
I don't understand why, but it really does seem as though
I have no idea what
it's
happened.
evaporated.
Yeah, it was just Halloween the other day.
I know they say that as you get older, time flies by faster, but I didn't realize I'd gotten that much older in the past year.
Surprise, surprise.
But here we are, quickly approaching Christmas, and we've been walking through some stories here in our Advent devotional, and this week we've been talking about the role of Pharaoh's daughter as well as Moses' sister, and some of the features of Moses actually being born and having a little baby put in a basket, right? And it's been interesting to think about this season, Advent, in terms of a baby boy in a basket rather than a baby boy in a manger.
Yeah.
But also the parallels and connections between those two.
Talk a little bit more about that. Just like, give me a lay of the land in the story of Scripture between, Moses and Jesus, right? We're paralleling these two, but why don't we dig into that a little bit?
I don't know. I just made it up.
What made you connect these two little babies?
Well, for me, the connection, the parallels that particularly Matthew draws, but also Luke draws between the birth of Jesus and the birth of Moses, I think, are very intentional. And again, it all shows. We talked about this a little bit, I think, last week, but it all goes to show the pattern of God's activity and the fact that God is not random. God does new things, but he doesn't do random things. And so there's a pattern to how God works, and you see this pattern kind of consistently being laid out in Scripture. And that's helpful for us to glom onto, because it helps us to see that pattern in our own lives and in the life of the church, right? So in thinking about this year, as I said before, thinking about kind of trying to figure out what Mary might have been thinking about, right? When she was having this an incredibly new experience of God happen to her, and Joseph and the shepherds and all these guys, what stories of their tradition would they have looked back at in order to try to make sense of this new experience? What pattern would they look back for, in their own tradition, their own story? And for me, the first thing that pops up is the birth of Moses, the story of Moses, and not just Moses, but the story of God redeeming and creating the people of God by redeeming them from slavery. And so, thinking about little baby Moses and in his ark, in his little ark, right, that his mother creates for him, much like Noah built an ark for his family. You have this again sense of wonder, I think, and sense of seeing how God continues to work in these little odd little moments, these moments where you wouldn't really expect God to show up, or where you don't think God maybe is even in play, because Moses' mother has to basically act in desperation here in order to try to save her child. Whereas I think a lot of times when we think, well, if God's work is obvious in something, you can see that, like it's a big thing, right? But here we see like for instance, with the Red Sea, right? The Red Sea parts. That's obviously God is at work here, right? That's a big sign. That's a huge sign. That's a huge wonder, right? But here in Moses' story at the very beginning, you have a desperate mother trying to save her child, and it doesn't seem like this is God at work. It seems like this is Moses' mom at work trying to save. And yet, she puts this basket in the reeds, and who finds it? Pharaoh's daughter. And what happens? Moses gets adopted into the palace. He gets adopted into the family of Pharaoh, who's trying to kill him indirectly. And there's this sense of wonder and irony there. And it's a small thing. It's just one baby in one basket. It's not a whole people crossing a whole sea. But I find it interesting. I think it's as much a powerful of a sign and a wonder of God than anything else we see in the story.
That contrast is something that we see a lot too. The rich and poor, weak and strong, those tension moments. So this idea of this little Hebrew boy, I would assume, born into slavery, into poverty, right?
Yeah.
Being adopted by the great Pharaoh, growing up in luxury and power in a palace. That's an interesting little contrast point.
It's a turn, right? It's one of those twists in a story that you look for to make a dramatic story, right? And here we have a kid who should be dead,
right?
By all intents and purposes. Like he should be dead. His mother should have obeyed the command and thrown him in the river, and yet he's going to grow up to be the prince of Egypt. And there's something interesting in that. There's and again, it doesn't say God does anything here in the text, and yet it's obvious that God is at work in this great moment. It fulfills a purpose because we know, knowing how the story goes, we know that eventually Moses, some decades later, is going to show up to talk to Pharaoh, and not this particular Pharaoh, maybe a Pharaoh that he grew up with, in the palace. And it's because he grew up with him, or because he grew up in the palace and has some kind of marking of being an Egyptian palace dweller, that he's able to even approach Pharaoh in the first place. Because otherwise he's just an Israelite slave, right? And so no Israelite slave can approach Pharaoh and say, hey, let my people go. It's because he has the recognition of having grown up in the palace with some kind of authority and wealth and privilege, that he's able to do that. God uses that, it's like Esther in a sense. It's like a turn of Esther, like, for such a time as this, you've been put in this position.
That's an interesting question for us to think about for ourselves too. Like, what places of power and privilege do we find ourselves in that we could use not to our own advantage, but to be a voice of God, right? To be a voice for the least, the last, and the lost, to, be the voice of love and truth.
That's right.
How much, I'm gonna ask you a history question here. What would Moses's young life have looked like, right? As a Hebrew baby adopted by Pharaoh's daughter, right?
Yeah.
Is he, I know, we get that whole line about he's handed back to his mother and then mom gets conveniently paid to raise him, right? That's fantastic.
For a couple years.
Right. But, she's nursing him. So, but what would that have looked like? Because, does he, become a teenager with the tradition of Hebrew scripture in him?
Yeah.
Is he taught that by his mother? Is he taught that by tutors?
Yeah.
Is he, or how Egyptian is he? I guess maybe is my question.
Well, it's really interesting. That's a great question because we don't know. Number one, we don't know for sure one way or the other. There's some indication that he has some understanding of his people's tradition and his people's story. Whether or not he gets that from his mom, maybe his mom continues to play a role in his life, even beyond, maybe she's allowed to stay in the temple, or not the temple, in the palace, and be a part of his, he has some kind of relationship with his siblings, Miriam and Aaron, that shows up later in Exodus.
Right, that's true.
And yet, so he understands that he's Hebrew, like he knows that he's Hebrew. So it's not as though he's being raised to think he's Egyptian. So he has some understanding of who he is in light of his tradition, his people. That being said, his experience of being Hebrew is radically different than his family and his people are slaves, and he's growing up in the opulence of the palace. So whatever he thinks he knows, he does not know through experience. He only knows through head knowledge, right?
Yeah.
If he knows anything at all. And again, there's some debate about that, like how much he does know. He doesn't understand it. That I can tell you, right? And we see that play out later on when Moses, as an older man, as a grown man, is taking a walk amongst the Israelites and seeing them as slaves, but he's just walking through, just untouched.
Yeah.
And he sees an Egyptian slave driver beating one of the other Israelites, and he takes control and actually kills that Egyptian, right? And I think he thinks he did something good, like I helped my people, right? And then he comes back the next day, and there's a couple Israelites that are fighting, and he steps in, like he's like, I'm the guy who steps in now, right? taking that position of authority, and he steps in, and the Israelites are like, who are you? Like, get out of here. Are you going to kill us like you killed the other guy? And then he freaks out, and then Pharaoh finds out that he murdered an Egyptian, and that's when he runs away into the wilderness. Like, he runs into a place called Midian, which I think is out in the Sinai Peninsula, because Mount Horeb is out there, Mount Sinai is out there. And so he runs out there and gets entangled with this other branch of Abraham's family that's not really related to Israel, but is indirectly related through Abraham. And he ends up getting related out there. And when he runs into them for the first time, they're like, oh, he's an Egyptian. Like, they recognize him. When they see him, they recognize him as an Egyptian. There's a priest out there who has 7 daughters, and they're out trying to gather water or something like that. And these people come up to try to accost them or whatever, and Moses steps in and saves them, right? Because he's like playing the hero, it sees like all the time.
Yeah, right. Well, there's 2 of those little stories there. Right?
So he steps in and he saves them, and then they go home and they tell their dad what happened. He's like, what happened? And they say, well, this Egyptian stepped in and saved us. And he's like, well, why didn't you bring him home? Like, go get him, bring him back. And then he gives one of his daughters to marry Moses, and Moses begins a whole new life out in the wilderness, out in out by Mount Sinai, where he's gonna one day lead the people of Israel, years and years and years down the road. But that's where this whole story is. So like the twists and turns of Moses' story are fascinating, because he's born a slave, he becomes a prince, and then he ends up a migrant. It's like the reverse, or maybe not the reverse. It's kind of like Gladiator. That scene in Gladiator where he's like, he talks about, I was a general who became a slave who became a gladiator, whatever. Great movie, by the way. But yeah, the ups and downs of his story are really fascinating. I think really play a role in how God is preparing him to lead his people, right? And even after all of that, as we're going to see next week, stepping into the story of the burning bush and the Red Sea crossing, leading up to the birth of Jesus Christ, which, again, I know those things don't go together naturally in our head, but they do. I promise they do. Even then, he's still unsure. I think what you find is a man here who based on being born the way he was born and put in the basket and raised in the palace and then runs away out into the wilderness, it's a man who's undergoing a deep identity crisis.
Well, I was going to say, it sounds like, just based on hearing that arc, my guess would be that his lack of confidence comes from never quite fitting in. Yeah. Right? He's like always in a place where he's not quite fully, he's not quite fully Egyptian. He's not fully royalty. He's still Hebrew, right? And he's not quite totally in power, but he's not totally identified with these other people. They don't totally trust him. Right. Right.
And he's Hebrew, but he's not really Hebrew. He doesn't understand the experience of being Hebrew.
That would be a little bit of an identity crisis for sure.
Yeah, right. And we've talked about this this paradigm of identity that I've shared with the class, and I've had discussed many times before. But basically, our identity comes from at its root. Our identity comes from the community that we participate in. But if we participate in multiple communities, then our identity is fractured. It's multifarious. It's a lot. And so. And I think a lot of people can identify with Moses in this situation, because today in the world that we live in, we all participate in multiple communities. We have our church community, and we have our work community, and we have our home community, our family community. We have our larger family community, and then maybe we have like a Georgia football community or whatever else. Like, we have a bunch of different communities we participate in, and all of those communities overlap and are similar in some ways, but in other ways they stretch and pull at us, so that sometimes when we get to the place of who we are, we can be fractured. And this is just more and more true, particularly as you look to the next generation. As I look at my kiddo, and we look at younger people and how they have all these online communities, and they have these communities that they're virtually a part of, and a lot of those communities are producing practices and stories and virtues and convictions that don't line up with the identity of Jesus Christ. And that's when we fall into those kind of problems, right? And that's something that our generations had to deal with, and it's something that the generation before us, it's something that's always been here. And I think it's definitely what we see happening here with Moses, is that he's participated in so many different communities. How is it possible that he could know who he is?
That's I think you're absolutely right. I've had a conversation kind of like that with a friend of mine. It's not something I've thought about a ton in recent years because I mean, the longer I'm at Northside, I have had the privilege of kind of having my communities honed in.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I've met my main friend community is through this place, in one way or another. You know, it's my work community, it's my church community, and there's a lot of gifts and graces that come with that because you're less pulled in multiple directions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think most people don't have that experience. Like I said, I have a friend who, you know, like you said, it's that whole list, right? It's, you know, and she has 2 jobs. And so there's a community with each one of those jobs.
Yeah.
There's, you know, family that lives just 45 minutes away, but there's a separate community there and like a community that you grew up with and a community, you know, that she'll have with her kids and a church community, you know, it's just like, and then, you know, each one of I mean, like, think about the Christmas season, right? Each one of those communities wants to celebrate Christmas together, right? And everybody has a Christmas party, and suddenly you're pulled in 5 different directions, and there's no time, you know, to sit and be.
That's right.
But, you know, I mean, this is why we're so busy in the world. And, you know, I mean, this is a common human problem. I'm not condemning the world or anything. You know, I think a lot of people experience this, but I think we don't think about it or talk about it in these ways a whole lot. But for me, that's a helpful thing to think about, right? Like, how many communities are you part of? And while they all may provide value, are there so many communities that are pulling you in one way or the other that it makes peace,
it makes having
or
peace of
rest
mind
or Sabbath? Does it make that hard?
Or does it make it impossible?
Does it make it impossible?
I think that's a great question, and maybe something to sit back and think about, particularly during this time of year. The other thing I would say is this, along the same lines of what you're talking about. How often do you when you have a Christmas dinner, a family dinner on Christmas Day or whatever, right? and you pull together a larger family, all right, and you have aunts and uncles and you have cousins and you have maybe even like long lost whoever coming back for Christmas or whatever. Now you're pulling multiple communities into one community, at least for that day, for that dinner or whatever. And how much chaos does that usually cause, right? Now, it also can cause a great amount of joy and whatever, depending upon what you decide to emphasize and what you decide to focus on during that meal or during that day or that time or whatever. But you pull all of those different communities together, and it can also cause a lot of chaos and a lot of uncomfortableness for people. And the reason why it is uncomfortable is because of these clashing communities or clashing identities. You know, it's very common for people to be a different kind of person in the community, in the presence of different communities. And it's not that they're being fake. It's not that they're being inauthentic, but it seems as though we all have masks that we wear depending upon who we're with. If you're sitting down with your parents or with your children, you act differently, or at least you emphasize different parts of your personality differently than when you're hanging out with your friends watching a football game, right? And all these things. And so it's very common, you know, imagine then you put all of those people together, you know, some way or somehow, and then you've got to wear all those masks at the same time. And it's enough to drive a person insane. Imagine Moses sitting down for Christmas dinner and he's invited his mom, right?
The Hebrew,
he's
right?
invited his mom and
Hebrew
his sister,
slave.
right? The Hebrew slave, his mom and his sister. Right, and he's also invited Pharaoh's daughter, his stepmom. Right, all right. Is there going to be tension there? I don't know. Right, he's invited his Pharaoh's dad, and he's invited her dad, Pharaoh, and he's there. Right, but he's also now invited his new father-in-law, Ruel or Jethro, whichever one you want to call him. All right, and his new wife, Zipporah, that he gets out in the wilderness, and also, by the way, Yahweh's decided to show up. Right now, imagine all of these people are sitting around a table with Moses, and they're like, Moses, take the lead, say the prayer, give the blessing. Like, who's Moses in that situation? Like, if you think about Moses, like, he has to be asking the question, like, I don't know who I am.
Or who I'm supposed to be, or what these people expect of me.
Exactly. And imagine he also invites the Israelites.
The Israelites, like wandering in the wilderness. So they're looking at him as a leader.
Oh, right. So now they're all gathered together, and they're like, Moses, give the blessing, and Moses, carve the ham.
And he's Moses, like, do I hand it over to Pharaoh? I'm not sure. Do I take charge here? I don't know.
Exactly. And that's when Yahweh steps up and says, and this is really important, and I think something that we're going to see coming up this week, but that's when Yahweh steps up and God steps up and says, it doesn't matter who you are because I am. And if you will just simply tether and find your identity in me, everything else will be taken care of. And in this season of Christmas, and thinking about all of the ways in which we're pulled in so many different directions, and how our identity can become so fractured, or at least we can become so overwhelmed, and peace of mind, it seems like almost impossible to find. I like the alliteration of that. Peace of mind is almost impossible to find.
This is the author of all your devotionals, friends.
I just like
he loves alliteration.
Like the way that came out. It's just the way my brain works. But in that situation, to remember that this baby that's being born and not put in a basket, but laid in a manger, a feeding trough for the world, for all the world to see, and for all the world to feed on, as he is the light of the world and the bread of life and the water of life and all those things. To remember that as the church and as Christians and as disciples of Jesus Christ, that we are supposed to be tethering and finding our identity in that one person. Who am I? I am a disciple of Jesus Christ. You know, and just that, and that's what God is trying to tell, or as we'll see coming up this week, but what God is going to try to tell Moses is, man, I know you must be really torn right now. Like you've had a weird life, you know, you were born a slave and you became a prince, and now you are a stranger and a foreigner in a foreign land. Don't worry about it. I got you. Yeah. Right. Because I am who I am. And I'm going to take it from here. And that's the gift, man. That's the gift of God, but it's also the gift of faith. And it's what it's the real reason for Christmas. Like why we celebrate Christmas is because of the identity of this baby. The identity of this baby who is not does not have a torn identity, is not identity crisis. This is God in the flesh. And this is a God who was born in the flesh so that we could be adopted into sonship and daughtership, into being a child of God. That adoption piece is important. We see it with Moses being adopted into the palace. We see it with Jesus being adopted by Joseph. Adoption is a key role. It plays a huge role. And Jesus is born so that through him we can be adopted into the family of God and therefore know who we are.
Yeah.
And whose we are, as the line goes, right?
Right. Well, and the important thing for me when I think about that is understanding that does not, while that is a beautiful metaphorical picture, and we should use it as a vision, and that's a guiding light, it is also very practical in the sense of by being adopted into the family of Jesus, it means we are learning the values of this family. We are being formed and shaped by the identity of this family. We learn from this family of God, and that teaches us who we are, and our identity is then formed by that, and then we can lay down those other expectations and those other those other priorities that these other groups and identity formative circles give us. Yeah. Right? And then the top thing becomes who we are in Jesus.
And in a sense, the only thing. Because this is what Jesus means. Well, you know, after he gets out of that manger and grows up, right, and becomes a man, and he gets out there.
I just pictured a little baby just like climbing out of this manger into being a fully grown man.
That's a good image. But once he gets out there on the road and begins his ministry, his main call is going to be to follow me, right? And there's going to be a lot of people who show up and say, "Man, I wish I could. Or I want to. I've got these other entanglements. I got to go bury my father, or I've got all this money, or I've got all these commitments, and I've got all these things, responsibilities. In other words, I have all these other identities that I need to attend to first, and then I'll come follow you." And Jesus says, "Well, then you're not fit. Don't worry about it," right? And Jesus continues walking on. Like, he doesn't force anyone into this identity, and that's the freedom and the grace and the gift of God. But if you want to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, you must have a complete and full identity in him. Christ the center, as Bonhoeffer would say. And that's exactly right. That's the challenge. And there's grace. And if we fall short of that, there's grace, sure, right? But that has to be the drive. That has to be the call. And that, again, we don't often think about stuff like that, I don't think, during the season of Christmas and Advent. But we can see the pattern playing out here. You know, with Moses, we see this pattern. We see this pattern of identity crisis, and then an option and a following being offered to him. Like, you can step forward or you can fade away.
Yeah.
Right? And it's the same with Jesus Christ. When he shows up and he offers that same identity to those who come to him, and they can either step up and follow or they can fade away. You know, you can either continue to live in the chaos that you live in, being pulled in all the directions that you're being pulled in, and never have peace of mind, let alone anything about salvation or sanctification. I hadn't even gotten that down the road. Or you can follow Jesus and know who you are, maybe for the first time.
Whew, that'll preach.
That's, you know, I guess so.
Yeah.
There's something, but that's the message of Christmas. That's the message that needs to be preached on Christmas Eve. That's the message that needs to be preached every time we talk about what it means for God to become flesh and for Jesus to be born in Bethlehem.
Amen.
I guess we'll leave it there for the day.
I think so. That feels
All right,
good.
Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here.
This was delightful.
Guys, I don't think we'll be back on here before Christmas, so Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas.
And we'll see you in the new year.